My name is Gerard Hosier, and I worked for about 18 years at the Beirut Street Bureau. It was a very interesting time working there. News was much different. Um, Over that period, and I sort of also worked freelance for a 20-year period, I probably covered every single war zone that was of significant importance to the Americans. So it was a very interesting period. Um, we saw a lot of things. It was a very interesting time in history, and it was actually sort of, I feel privileged to have seen the end of the last quarter of the century working at ABC. The end of the last century was the end of the Cold War. It was transitioning in China. It was there was a lot of change in the Middle East, a lot of very sort of dark things that were going on. There was also a lot of very positive things that happened at the time. There was much more certainty. At times that, from at least my perspective, seemed much simpler. News, the ABC News was one of the three main broadcasters, and ABC News at that time had a huge budget. I remember going to Frank Giulio, our money man, and I asked him, "Frank, how much have we got to spend on this job?" And he said, "Gerard, just don't worry about it." And budgets seemed possible. In fact, they were rejected in the early days. And the three networks at that time were basically covered the news, and many of our affiliates in the UK and around the world, we shared facilities, but we went out, and it was the Americans, when we arrived into town, we carried a lot of clout and privilege. And, there weren't media circuses like there are today. There weren't hundreds of agencies. There were just basically the three, particularly at the beginning of the job. And it was really, you got to see the news firsthand. Now, my recollection of the news is actually different to how I see the news today, or the historical news portrayed, because when you're there and you see a story happen, it's from your own perspective, and that was the advantage of being at the front line of news, was that you could see the news from your perspective. The news that was packaged sometimes even with ABC when it went back to America, sometimes I used to say, does this line up with anything that I see on the ground? And obviously there was an interest, that the news tied up with the US point of view or the UK point of view. But when you were actually on the ground, there were lots of other things that were taken into account. And one of the things that really has stood out for me is, in all those years of sort of 20 years of covering news, is there is no such thing as black and white. That's the thing that most prominently stands out in being in the front line of news. The wrong people were never always wrong, and the right people were never always perfect. And that is something that I sometimes find very hard to explain to people, because people always want to see a very binary point of view. But being with ABC and being in the news, I find that there's always two sides to every story, and usually only one side is told that suits our national interest. My time at ABC has been both good, positive, and it has actually taken a toll, Mike. I covered many stories. Some of them were very challenging. Funnily enough, I was looking through some pictures the other day, and I realized that some of the things in them were terrible, and I, with time passing, just didn't even remember those terrible things that happened in those photographs. And I think two stories that sort of stand out was my first story, which was going to Beirut. Beirut was a very big story in its day. It was one of those stories that occupied the news, the 6 o'clock news every night. And the first day I arrived there, in fact, in the morning I got up and there was this sort of loud bang, and I was very naive. And I thought, oh, this is how life is in Beirut. And what it transpired was it was the Marines bombing where I think 305 people died. And it was just, here's the strange thing is it was just so normal. You know, when you're in a war zone like that, everything becomes normal. It's all relative. You know, there were other stories within that time in Beirut. There was Shabra Shatila. There was also the Twa Hostage Crisis, which ABC had it was a very important story for ABC because we became part of that news story. So much so, I remember when we were staying at the Summerland Hotel, one night all the hostages came to the hotel whilst there were still hostages with reminders and with machine guns, and we actually had dinner with them. You know, and one of them passed me a letter or a phone thing for me to call his parents, but I couldn't get through. So, you know, Beirut sort of brought home to me how being in a war zone can disjoint you from what reality is. I remember seeing kids with machine guns, and this was the only thing they knew, to play with machine guns. And I looked at them and I was thinking, if that's all you know, when you grow up, that is all you're ever going to know. And that was one of the things. I became actually a primary school teacher because, not for long, but because I thought that being a primary school teacher was a point where you can affect children's lives when they are young and give them a solid grounding. Another story I covered, which affected me a lot, was Tiananmen Square. And the story grew and grew and grew. And the popular feeling was that there was going to be change. And it was, you know, there were marches on streets. And out of all the stories I've covered in all the years, the one thing I remember is there was these huge marches in the street. And it was so certain that change was going to come, that, you know, everyone from the police to the local army and the local farmers were all celebrating that this change was going to come. It was certain. And then things started to turn. They tried shutting down our satellite dish, and then it started to get darker and darker. And I went to the Beijing Hotel, which is the hotel where the classic or the iconic picture of Tiananmen Square took place. And we were there for about a week. Now, I remember sort of going there because the crackdown had started and they'd sort of cut off the ring road. And we managed to get sort of across the ring road a couple of times, even though it was being cut off. And I sort of remember going back to the hotel. ABC, I think, was staying at the Hyatt. And there was a girl there. She was Chinese. And everyone was absolutely scared because nobody knew what was going to happen. The whole basis of Chinese or Beijing's identity was sort of changing and also being pulled out at the same time. And everyone was terrified. Nobody knew who was in charge, which way it was going to go. And she asked me, she said, you know, I didn't know this girl. I mean, all I knew was she was at the photocopier. But she asked me, would you marry me and take me out of here? And I was single. And I thought, well, you know what? It doesn't matter. Yeah, I would. You know. Anyway, then I went back to across the ring road, back into Beijing Hotel. And I met, well, it was there with Jackie Judd, there was a chap called Bar, and I think there was two camera people. I can't quite remember. And we were there for a week, at least. And I remember everything had shut down. The Beijing army was in the square at that time. And after about a week, they brought in an army from the outside of Beijing to the inside, a rural army. And there was a real possibility that there was going to be a civil war between the Beijing army, who were influenced by the local marches, and the outside community. And we were in this hotel where they had, in the middle of these two factions, and it was really sort of terrifying, I guess. I'm not sure if terrifying is the right word to use. It was uncomfortable. And it went on for days and days. The army, the soldiers were climbing over the roof of the hotel. They were looking in all the rooms. There were two crews at that hotel. It was the ABC crew, and then there was a BBC crew. And the iconic picture could have come from either of those two locations. So it was there at that time for that picture. Now, I remember when that happened, that picture, I didn't really think much about it because it has become iconic and people use it to represent what happened in Beijing. But actually what I remember was the night of the crackdown. What happened was the army started shooting down the street in front of the Beijing hotel on the side. And they would shoot down and people would fall. And then people on bikes would come along with trolleys on the back and pick up the bodies or the injured and drive them away, and then somebody else would get hit, and then they would take the injured away. And those people, I thought, that group of people, I thought, were hugely. I really don't like using the word heroic, but they were the people who sort of stood out for me. The chap in Tiananmen Square, when he walked in front of the tank, what you got to remember, when he walked in front of that tank, the Chinese army would not have rolled over one of their own. That's sort of an intrinsic thing because it's the people's army, and that would never have happened. But it suits our narrative to see that as an iconic picture of, the small man against, the force of the state. But in reality, I think it was all those people on the ring road and, on the entrance roads to Tiananmen Square, where all the terrible things that happened, they were the people that stood out for me. So after the Beijing crackdown, the life in Beijing became more certain. And the girl I met at the photocopier who asked me to marry her, the urgency for that marriage evaporated because she was worried that I think that the elite were going to be affected, possibly through previous history. And I think that threat was removed. And so there wasn't that urgency for her to marry me and leave Beijing. After I left ABC, I migrated to Australia with my wife and, I had two children. And I still freelanced a little bit. In fact, I even freelanced for ABC and BBC and various other companies. And wars were becoming much rougher, much more unpredictable. In the time, the end of the last century, there was always this acceptance that there was news, and the press were always treated with respect by both sides. But that started breaking down after the turn of the century. And I remember when I had my first child, I remember thinking, this isn't a good place to be. And I did have a few encounters that were actually really life-threatening. And I decided that it was probably a good idea to leave. I decided to be a primary school teacher And I remember I went to university. It was 4 years of uni, and I remember getting a call from Faradun Hamani, who owned an uplink company, and he said, "Hey, Gerard, come on down here to Iraq." It was just at the beginning of the embedded cruise going in. Come on down and be part of a embedded crew. And I would have said yes, and because I always would say yes to a job. And I remember thinking, thank God I'm going to university and being a teacher, and that saved me from going to Iraq, the final Iraq. So I did do many Iraqs, but I didn't do the final push. And then so I became a teacher, but I realized I couldn't affect change. So I've become a university lecturer now, and I lecture in film and television. And I'm part of the sort of television industry in Australia. To sum up my time at ABC, what I remember most is the camaraderie. When a large job came together, everyone would come together. You didn't have to speak to anyone. Everyone knew their role. Your boss could be under you, or somebody could be over you. There was no hierarchy. Everyone knew what was needed to be done, and everybody did it. And that we played hard and we worked hard. Sometimes we worked 40-hour days. I remember many jobs where we worked 40-hour days, and then at the end we played very hard, like on the charter from Beirut to London and times in Moscow.